Satire is everywhere. It's in our favorite books, movies, television shows, and nearly everywhere on the internet. There's no doubt as to why this literary tool has become so popular in modern-day media. Satire may be one of the, if not the best persuasive device ever used. It's entertaining, humorous, and fun. Yet behind each use of satire, there's an underlying push towards bringing change to our society through the means of exposing and criticizing the less desirable facets in life. While satire may seem like a particular quirk in present-day media, it may not be as unique to us as you think. In fact, it's been estimated that satire has been used going back as far as the times of ancient Greek and Roman civilizations at around 500 to 60 BC. In these eras, satire was commonly found in comedic plays and sketches, frequently involving men dressed as satyrs, the mythological beings with the upper body of a man and the lower one of a goat. Clearly, these satyrs played a bit of influence on the satire genre as a whole. Satire may have originated during these early eras, but it didn't quite reach widespread usage until a little later in history, more specifically, the later Middle Ages. Along with this, there was one predominant piece of literature that excelled in its extensiveness of satire, and this was the Canterbury Tales written by Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales was a collection of stories, all told by the perspectives of different pilgrims traveling to Canterbury along their annual religious pilgrimage. Each character represented the various social roles during Chaucer's time period. These characters range from the rich and noble knight, to the grand array of the middle class, to the corrupt and immoral summoner and pardoner. In the general prologue, each character is described vividly from the point of view of the narrator, most likely Chaucer himself, and it is through the characterization given that satire is conveyed. But before we get into the story, we must first be aware of the context behind what Chaucer wrote, and to do this, we need to travel back to the 1300s. Welcome to the late Middle Ages, an era that brought about a massive change in the way of life, culture, and technical ambitions of the previous era. Because of the drastic changes made during this time period, it will also be helpful to understand the previous one as well. Named the High Middle Ages, this era was defined by a few important characteristics, specifically the Norman conquest, the origin of constitutional government, the growth of towns and cities, and the rise of a socio-political system called feudalism. Feudalism was very important in establishing the social order of people in their society. Essentially, feudalism was the idea that a higher person of power who owned land would lend other people, called vassals, the land, called fiefs, in exchange for services. In practice, a sort of triangle formation appears. The king was on top, owning all the land, giving fiefs to the lords, nobles, and barons, who then subdivide their land among knights, who in exchange pledged to protect the land for the lords and the king. The knights then gathered peasants to work the land in exchange for their protection. The land that the knights looked after, called manors, became the basic community for the feudal system. Now, this system actually worked very well. Remember that at the time there were constant threats for invaders or anyone that could endanger you and your family, and so having the assurance of protection from the knights was comforting and relieving. However, not all people were thrilled with this kind of system. Mainly the rising middle class, composed of the merchants and craftsmen established from the expanse of large towns in England. These people would have been happy when the feudal system collapsed during the late Middle Ages. The start of the late Middle Ages wasn't too pleasant. A little downward change in the yearly climate caused the entire agriculture production to suffer drastically. The growth season shortened and there were constant worries of flooding and huge storms, and these problems escalated when the generations of intensive farm practices exhausted the nutrients from most farmland soil. Along with this, another issue called the bubonic plague arrived in 1347, and wreaked havoc on any condensed population in a town or city. Demand for food and labor sharply rose, while the supply crashed to the floor. The feudal system just wasn't going to work anymore. Peasants would now offer their working services in exchange for pay, and experienced life with just a little more freedom. After this, there was an uprising against the higher classes, and their insistence on keeping the feudal system and charging high rents for land. Somewhat inspired by this rebellion against feudalism was the attack on the church, an attempt to dissolve power from the almighty authority. Many were disenchanted with the church after they condemned all those who embraced mysticism to ease their problems. Mysticism was a new concept wherein there was a belief that knowledge of spiritual truth can be achieved through deep thought, a practice that the Church thought would alleviate their control over religion. All this aside, there was a few other important cultural aspects that impacted life during this time, these being chivalry, romance, and a drive towards learning. Chivalry came directly from the Crusader heroic code of conduct that governed how every knight should pledge loyalty on and off the battlefield, and to pledge his service to a lady. This standard became a well-established ideal that people based themselves off of. Academically, learning centers became favorable over religious monasteries, and these learning centers eventually grew to become the large universities that we know today. Places like Oxford became known for their grandiose centers of learning across Europe. Now, Chaucer actually began writing the Canterbury Tales near this beginning part of the era around 1387, and he continued writing up until his death at the start of the 15th century. With a solid understanding of the background behind Chaucer's writing, let's return back to the story. Chaucer uses these various characters that represent the different social roles in society to establish satire. He accomplishes this in the prologue mainly through his descriptions of each character, and uses plenty of characterization techniques to do so. Satire can be expressed this way in that the humorous and exaggerated descriptions can help expose flaws and reveal the truth of the issues of these roles in society. It would be easy to have certain characters that are a good or bad ideal of their social role to establish this satire, but Chaucer develops his characters a little more creatively. Instead of having these cookie-cutter models for his characters, Chaucer fabricated each one to be unique, having their own skills and imperfections, so that he could later use their complicated personalities in their own stories. Because his characters are given these complex personas to be later developed in their own tales with their own perspective, you won't always find direct satirical characterization from the descriptions in the prologue. Take, for example, the knight, who is constantly praised and respected by Chaucer for his bravery and chivalrous nature. While not initially satirized in the prologue, some satire may arise in the knight's tale, when we could see the knight's perspective on the world and how it may contrast from his initial characterization. Generally, though, most characters are satirized in some form or another during the prologue. When describing these characters in the prologue, they can all fit into 6 distinct social categories. Interestingly, Chaucer describes each category from higher classes downwards. There's the representatives of the aristocracy and those with nobility, consisting of the knight, the squire, the yeoman, the prioress, the monk, and the friar. The friar should be in a lower social order, but he is very prosperous and respected for his begging and wisdom. Next is the commercial wealth-derived upper class, consisting of the merchant who gained money through illegal trade with French coins, the sergeant of law who profited from his knowledge of law, the Oxford clerk that uses his wealth to pursue his knowledge and learning, and the franklin who uses his land-owning riches to host lavish feasts for his district. There's the guildsmen, a group of miscellaneous men who aren't really described in much detail and don't have their own individual stories, yet represent the specialized union of craftsmen in society. There's the middle class, consisting of the cook, a respected master of his trade, the shipman, a world traveler with immense knowledge, a physician, and the wife of Bath, a loyal churchgoer. The next 2 classes can both be described as being lower class, but are seen differently in society. There's the virtuous lower class, consisting of the parson and the ploughman, both being characters who display virtuous Christian values. And then there's the immoral lower class, consisting of the manciple, the miller, the reeve, the summoner, and the pardoner, all of whom display some form of corruption, vulgarity, or immoral values. Chaucer satirizes each group through the character's description, and while he may tend to satirize the lower classes a bit more, each group is thoroughly satirized. Some characters are blatantly satirized, such as the prioress, the summoner, and the pardoner, and some other characters show satire through contrasting with other characters, such as the knight with the miller, and the Oxford clerk with the man of law. Let's start with the prioress, a nun who is described as being flirtatious and romantic, characters not typically seen in a religious figure. She redefines her role by incorporating these woman-like behaviors in the royal court, such as her sensitivity and tender heart towards animals, and supplements this with her Latin courtly love motto, Amor vincit omnia, meaning love conquers all. Her devotion to courtly love represents the influence of romance during Chaucer's time period. Chaucer satirizes this romantic persona by sarcastically describing her less than perfect French accent by saying she spoke daintily in French, extremely. He also teases her physical appearance by saying her forehead was fair of spread. This helps to reinforce the satirization by contrasting her desire for ladylike behavior by introducing a rough physical characteristic. While she demonstrates a realistic portrayal of a human being through these physical descriptions and the way she is concerned for the life of a mouse and is perfectly fine with feeding luxury food to her dogs, it is these characteristics that, when paired with her role as a nun, exposes flaws in her persona to be satirized. The next two characters, the summoner and the pardoner, are both in the immoral lower class and are similar in characteristics. The summoner is a man of the church who seeks to find those who violate church law and bring them to justice. He is often drunk and uses power corruptly for his own personal gain. Chaucer describes the summoner very unpleasantly, saying he has a fire-red face, and that no quicksilver, lead ointment, tartar creams, nor brimstone could purge the pimples sitting on his face, and that he was as hot and lecherous as a sparrow. It's clear to see that Chaucer dislikes this character, and in doing so, he satirizes this social role by exaggerating the corruption through his grotesque physical appearance and scandalous personality. The summoner is also said to embrace the Latin quote, Quistino quid juris, which ironically means, what is the point of the law? Under the same vein as the summoner, the pardoner shares Chaucer's disrespect, as he uses his power of selling false indulgences, the act of paying money to repent one's sins in the Catholic Church, for his own monetary gain. He is mocked for his long, flowing hair that's as yellow as wax, his same small voice a goat has got, and is compared to a gelding or a mare. In comparing the pardoner to a gelding, it's implied that he could be a eunuch, a man who's been castrated, or a homosexual. Even though the description of the pardoner may suggest someone who's not too respected at this time, it is actually said that he is very persuasive and a good storyteller, and it is through his smooth talking that he's able to manipulate others to pay him for his services. Chaucer uses this manipulative personality, combined with the pardoner's lacking physical appearances, to create a satirical representation of this clergy role. By using satirical characterizations of the pardoner, Chaucer exposes the act of indulgence, a common act during this time period from church members. In doing so, he attempts to bring attention to this injustice in society, and persuade people to feel how he does about the issue of indulgence. Looking now at other characters, such as the knight and the miller, they contrast each other to express satire through exposing each other's flaws. The knight is described as the most distinguished man in the group, a man who has fought through battle after battle, and yet is beaten in strength by the vulgar, slightly demonic miller who boasted that he could heave any door off hinge and post. In comparing these two characters, Chaucer satirizes the desire for strength over courtliness through the boastly description of the miller and the perfect description of the knight. Looking now at the Oxford clerk and the man of law, each one is described as being devoted to money. However, the difference between them lies in that the clerk uses his money for his obsessive studying, reinforcing his oblivious to worldly issues, and the man of law uses his law study for monetary gains. This flipped nature exposes the flaws in the clerk, his obliviousness, as well as the flaws in the man of law, his lack of academic intellect. There are, of course, plenty of other examples of satire throughout the prologue, such as the appeal for the yeoman to be of higher class with his fancy clothing, and the ironic description of the professional shipman with the dishonest theft of wine. But it's probably best to leave those for another time. If there's anything to be learned from this, it's that satire, be it used in the 14th century as part of a poetic frame story, or in 2016 with the vast array of political satire, satire is a valuable tool for any writer, director, or anyone who wishes to bring change, and is not going to go away anytime soon.